The opposition misses the comparative in this debate. If they truly think they're a set of Black women that can access the humanities better than a set of Asian women, they're crazy. Clearly in this debate, the comparative is that it is actually the difference between being seen as Asian or being seen as any other form of minority. Note that the sets of harms on those sets of other minorities are crushing. We tell you ours comparatively is a far better world. Firstly, what actually is being an Asian minority? We agree with lots of their analysis about how things like integrate better and things like you're law abiding. But I think also in particular is the fact that you work particularly hard and you tend to be quite successful in the forms of the amount of effort that you put in, but also additionally the fact that you do not have forms of dangerous religious affiliations, you tend to be quite secular, and also just in general that you tend to succeed in forms of things like education or in terms of careers. I think their analysis on just like these people tend to bottle their emotions up more. It's like maybe, but like it's pretty marginal. It seems like that is a norm that happens with lots of different races. It seems unclear why that was particularly harmful or important in this debate. What do we actually care about in this debate? Three broad things. Firstly, what is the actual comparative? Note the opposition doesn't even consider this, and I think it debilitates their entire case. Secondly, what are the specific benefits to these individuals within these communities? And finally, how do individual behaviors change on the whole? What is the actual comparative? First, you act like any other, or you look like any other minorities. The reasons are fourfold. First, because you are racially different, you are an other, you are seen as an alien, particularly to the extent that you are foreign and you are new in these countries. Second, because there are sets of language barriers, even accents here prejudiced against you. Thirdly, because there are deep historical stereotypes perpetuated by things like media, which set you up like to look like any form of other minority. But fourthly, just to the extent that you are small in numbers and you are a minority in general, you are particularly easy to ostracize and target. Note immediately that the comparative therefore is you literally compare the model like minority sets Asians apart from the other forms of minorities in this debate, and immediately you see enormous benefits in terms of the ability to access things like political representation, the ability to access legal protection, the abilities for you to like engage in forms of professions, in forms of education, and just the extent that you are seen with lower prison rates. All of this immediately suggests that there are enormous benefits. Opposition never contends with those. What are those benefits specifically? They look like three certain things. First, you are perceived as harmless and particularly safe. That is for three broad reasons. The first is because you integrate particularly well into these countries, not ceded by opposition. The reasons why you integrate particularly well are things like forms of interracial marriage, things like you are less vocal about certain concerns, but far more importantly, that you're not racially or religiously charged, and you're particularly separate from your homeland government, that you're seen as part of this new country. All of that meant you were seen as pretty harmless. Secondly, I just think you were respected more to some extent. That is, that you were seen like you were a hard worker and you were always going to do a good job at the things that you do. And not that applies even to deeply racist people. But secondly, just the fact that you see professionals that are Asian everywhere in like medicine and accounting, that I think just builds you some immediate initial respect. That was beneficial. But secondly, I think under this as well, like individuals are unlikely to be particularly jealous of you. Those are firstly because you are not taking the particularly low paid job. And in particular, even if you are not seen as a lazy person taking those particularly low paid jobs. But secondly, just because there are like enormous amounts of career paths, such as being a doctor, which are dominated by Asians, it seems that there is no problem when there's specific paths, just when there's more general and total control. Thirdly, I just think they're seen as harmless to the fact that their religious beliefs are largely secular and largely undangerous. But fourthly, just to the extent that the opposition sees that they're particularly law-abiding, they're seen as safe citizens. Immediately note that the set of impacts of this win us the debate on the straight from the get-go. Reasons are fivefold. First, because you feel so much easier to integrate within society, that looks like you gain more access to political representation. That means it's easier to vote for those people. It means you can form greater friendships and bonds with people of different races. It means you have greater access to sets of jobs. It means you feel more secure within those communities. You're less likely to feel bad. Secondly, because you are have way less racist behaviors against you, that is, you face less microaggressions, that is, you face less sets of slurs, that is, that you feel like you engage with people on a more individual and personal level. Thirdly, you are less affected by rising concerns of national security. I think their comparative here looks awful. If Asians look like any other form of race like Black people, and the CCP was doing the sorts of things it was still doing, I think that is where you get the truly sets of crushing harms under this debate. Fourthly, you just gain access to more positions of power to the extent that people perceive you less as a threat and they're more willing to place you there, even in their best case, where you do less stuff in those positions and you are less vocal. Note that you gain the initial foothold into those positions in the first place. That accelerates organic change and wins us the debate on its spot. Fifthly, I just think you just literally gain way less government things that hurt you. In particular, this looks like things like over-policing. Just don't get that of Asian communities, and that is enormously beneficial. Secondly, I just think you are perceived as more qualified in general, and this has two big benefits. Firstly, because you're way less easier to access sets of jobs, particularly when that stereotype applies for you, but also just in general, that is that you are seen as a person that is likely to succeed at their job, who are probably a good or qualified fit. But secondly, I just think you broadly have more respect to the extent that even if you aren't a part of those jobs that like give you those forms of money, that individuals see you differently and they treat you differently because of that. That was a benefit. And note here that the benefits again are enormous. You like succeed in education interviews to the toughest colleges because they think you will perform. You like tend to have access to higher paid jobs to the extent they think you are more qualified. But far more importantly, that money is reinvested in ways that are critical. That is, that you all of a sudden have greater healthcare to the extent that's tied to your job. But more importantly, that you can fund your community better and you can support the most in need in your community. Clear sets of benefits here. Thirdly, I think the opposition wants to target the sets of individuals that can't engage with this stereotype. 4 reasons why we don't care much about them. First, there are particularly small amounts of individuals in this community. That is firstly because they've been socially conditioned to not be like that. But secondly, and more importantly, there's enormous selection bias, right? The individuals that are typically of immigrant families are the least likely to be of the non-conforming stereotypes. Secondly, I think they're just supported by their community. This was the stuff particularly about funding that I mentioned earlier, but also critically about political representation. Thirdly, I think that the pressure exists under both sides of the house, but it is in fact a lower under our side. That is that there will be a set of internal pressures regardless, right? But in particular here, you all of a sudden have access to the external like alleviating factor. That is that like particularly Australian communities like see these Chinese communities as putting on too much more pressure, right? That means you get media articles saying this pressure is excessive, etc. That means that you like if you don't conform with that stereotype, you can engage better with this external pressure, saying that that is not okay. Secondly, under pressure here, I just think like to the extent that it leads to success, it's probably a great thing. Secondly, just like the marginal amount more pressure from this external narrative seems minor, particularly to the extent that is only the way that other people perceive you, but you're more likely to be perceived within your internal community. But also thirdly, that the harms are small here. Like sure, people feel a little bit worse, whatever. Last thing, the opposition mentions there's a set of harms to employment norms. Immediately note that it is deeply uncomparative, that it is obviously way worse as a Black person to face those norms. But secondly, there's actually a set of benefits under our side. That is that you gain more respect to the extent you can form better bonds and relationships with individuals to the extent that you're perceived more harmlessly, which means you can access the things that they want, like positions of power. But thirdly, I just think there's like, the stuff about organic change accelerates drastically under our side. That was winning. Thirdly, how do individual behaviors change? Why do we win off this as well? Immediately note that I think there is a set of norms that dictates that any kid now can succeed, that it is just like you're part of this group and that means that you just need to put in the hard work and you will do well. Secondly, I just think that the pressure actually really helps these kids, as in it holds them to higher standards and it really prompts them to do better in their later life. And note in particular that they will face that pressure presumably at some point in time if they are successful, and it helps them set up for that additional pressure in the long term. Finally, I just think you get more interracial marriage. Note the opposition says this might be coercive, etc. But when you literally now have a job and an education, these harms are smaller than this debate. Proud to propose.
The counterfactual in this debate was not that Asian people would be considered with the same stereotypes as Black people. It wasn't that they would be considered to have the same religious extremism as Arabs are assigned within America today. We didn't think that what the comparative looked like, because that failed to engage with the nuanced characterization that we told you at first, that basically said Asian people's stereotypes were associated in an extremely different way. What that looked like was that those people were generally able to accumulate wealth earlier. They conceded this in their own characterization. They were able to show a degree of academic success. They had high pressure to assimilate. And as a result, the stereotypes were very different. That meant it looked like that they were perceived as docile. They were perceived as following rules. We thought that was harmful. We gave you multiple reasons why. But as such, the counterfactual that we were we wanted to show you here is that it was far better for that success, rather than being a super aggressive thing and being forced upon those people to the detriment of their mental health, to the detriment of them being able to express their identity freely. We thought it was going to look more like how Jewish people are treated, how people who had like accumulated a large amount of success in going into a culture, but weren't forced to be a model minority, which we thought was something that was going to be not only really harmful to the individual, but also structural racism as a whole. I'm going to talk about that throughout this speech. Okay, so let's deal with a couple of things. The first, firstly, I'll just briefly touch on the counterfactual just to expand on that introduction. Second of all, was success and benefits they tried to claim actually worth it on their side? And thirdly, I'd like to talk a bit about how structural racism actually operated here. So first of all, again, we'd note that the comparative here wasn't like how to like the over policing and violence inflicted on Black people and Black bodies. We thought that this was likely because people didn't fear Asian people in the same way. That was because it wasn't associated with crime. Again, we tell you at Harry, the analysis here was more likely those people would be associated with being docile, with being submissive. We again thought those stereotypes were really harmful, but they were very different from the way that those stereotypes operated on other people. We thought, therefore, our counterfactual looked like having a less aggressive focus on success, because we told you that was really harmful to the individual, but I'll also get into how that's harmful to structural racism. That was the counterfactual we wanted to clarify on their side, on our side, sorry. Okay, so was success actually a benefit on their side? Because a lot of the benefits they try to claim was symmetric. We got like, it looked the same as what we tried to tell you, but what we showed you on our side was that those success and those benefits were not nearly as good as what they tried to claim, but also that they came with an extreme trade-off on how that impacted the individual, which we thought was really harmful. So let's touch on a couple of them. The first thing they tell us is that integrating successfully into society and having assimilation was very useful because you were able to get success in your career, because you were able to go on and get more political representation. What did that actually look like here? It meant the definition of success was necessarily extremely limited due to what that stereotyping actually looked like. So maybe you got a lot of Asian doctors, which of course was very inspiring to those people who wanted to be doctors, but it meant you got like no Asian teachers, no Asian social workers. And that was also really harmful, not only because you needed those to actually like provide for people, like for a diversity of people, but also because if you aspired to be something that was outside that narrow range of success, that was going to be really harmful for you. So what we saw there was that when that success was inextricably tied with assimilation, was tied with stereotypes, there weren't those same avenues that we wanted, that they wanted to tell you. We also tell you this is really impactful in particular on women who already face the stereotype as women, like that they don't fit in STEM, but then the stereotype is Asian people that they like aren't able to express emotions or something, which is obviously absurd, meant that they weren't able to get into those like more humanities professions. And we also saw that they reported more discrimination there as well, really just confining them to like working from home or like being stay-at-home mothers, which again, we thought was pretty bad and pretty harmful on their side. The second thing they tell you here is this is really good for political representation. Honestly, if we wanted to buy that, I'd like them to point to like more than 5 Asian politicians that are actually in politics at the moment, because that wasn't true. And that was for the reasons that we told you, that people like that the stereotypes associated with assimilation, with achieving really highly in society, were associated with being docile and with conforming with rules and therefore not being great leaders. That's why we didn't get those people elected. And we thought that stereotype, that model minority idea, was really harmful. They actually got worse political representation as a result. So they finally then say that they kind of conceded that this success would be like traded off with the individual happiness of like those people. And they thought that they were willing to cop that harm in this debate. We would tell you that this is actually probably the worst thing that they could do strategically, because the most important people in this debate were the individuals that were coming up in that community. And when this was something that was inflicted on all of those people, that meant you saw that harm occurring en masse. That meant that we already saw sky-high levels of depression and in particular anxiety. That was an extremely important thing to acknowledge here. And also that given there was this model minority assumption that you didn't need help with that they weren't going to reach out to the services that could help them most. That was really harmful. We thought that on that analysis alone, we weren't willing to trade off that success narrative that they gave us. Again, that was limited with that. But the second thing is that it also really decreased your ability to be diverse, because it meant that if you had like a queer identity and your model minority success, like your assimilation story meant that you had to get married to a man, for example, that was going to be really harmful for you because you weren't able to kind of live and express that identity freely. We thought this could never be traded off with what they told us their success was. We also would probably impact this with the fact that like maybe a fifth generation Asian family was like had the wealth accumulated that they were able to kind of partake in this success. But that didn't mean that was afforded to a first generation immigrant family. And we thought that was really important here because it meant that none of those standards or metrics of success were helpful there. Even more pressure was exerted on that. That was really bad. Yep. Yep. Also, just to impact like why that submissiveness was tied to that model minority, we thought that was because it was inextricably bound up with the idea of assimilation. We thought assimilation was a really important point. We would like to hear a response there. Okay, let's quickly talk about structural racism and why this got so much worse under their side. We thought that obviously racism still existed against Asian people. It just looked quite different from how it was generally perceived with like Indigenous people, with African Americans and so on. But in the case of a model minority system, the burden to overcome that discrimination came away from systems, it came away from politics, and it was pushed onto individuals. Why was that such a terrible thing? First of all, the pressure from assimilation within your community meant you were less likely to be able to get outreach in terms of like getting support for that. That means like less access to like affirmative action, less access to any of the like, you know, discourse and support that you could get for discrimination you were facing. Second of all, we thought it meant that structural racism kind of existed in very unique ways. What we see in affirmative action programs in American universities is basically that because generally the like success is like empirically higher for Asian people over there, that they actually have even lower quotas than white people in getting into those universities, even though they probably experience a lot more disadvantage than those white people who are able to hire like their squash coaches and so on to get into them. So that was actually obviously really bad. They were being locked out despite facing some disadvantage. Thirdly, and quite importantly here, we thought this was really bad for like public discourse in terms of how racism was framed, because it was very easy for white people in power, for politicians to basically dismiss that structural racism existed against Asian people because they were succeeding and because they wanted to because they were able to like pull themselves up by their bootstraps or something. We thought this was used as a particularly malicious talking point against like, you know, other groups that weren't succeeding. And we thought that again was going to like basically dismiss what structural racism looked like. That was so much worse for discourse. Why was this so important? Firstly, we tell you that it gives you less social capital and public will for people to basically redress past discrimination, often because it was erased. We didn't see very much of it in public discourse because it was overcome as set for example. Secondly, we thought it was a lot less outreach by the individuals who were seeking support when they faced that sort of discrimination, when they faced individual prejudice, when they faced like, you know, again, that affirmative action quota going against them. And thirdly, again, differentiating between a first generation immigrant and a fifth generation. Maybe they were able to get wealth for that person who was already well established, but they couldn't help those people who had just come into that country. At the end of this debate, at the end of this speech, I think I've shown you that that success was never worth trading off that individual happiness. But even if it was, we got worse structural racism. That was why we were proud to affirm.
When the counterfactual they give you is, oh, it'll just be like Jewish people. Well, I'm sorry, but Jewish people are a model minority, right? They exactly thrive off things that like things like hard work, that they have like certain professions that they are good at. That is exactly what we stand for on our side of the house, right? Because the unfortunate reality for the affirmative team is they can't pick and choose which aspects and elements of the model minority myth, like the model minority they choose to use. Like you cannot disregard things like the fact that you're probably really intelligent and hardworking, and that perception benefits you in society. But secondly, here, insofar as they have proven, like they wanted to say to you, like being like the Jewish stuff was good because like it meant that they have access to things like, you know, good, like they have good perceptions. Then all of our benefits of like being a model minority actually still stand within this debate. Three questions we're going to look at. Firstly, what does the model minority look like? Secondly, what is the effect of this on individuals? And finally, why this perception allows for acceptance from broader society and better tangible outcomes. On the first thing of what this model minority perception looks like, I think it's important to note that like the counterfactual, right, which is a world in which you are still demonized because you are an other, or you are told that you are like people also don't hate, like people hate you for taking jobs because they think you're lazy, but not because you're actually hardworking. That was a far worse world. That was a world in which you were going to get locked out from things like education, like education. That was a world in which you were going to constantly face things like being vilified or like have racist slurs thrown at you, or face a lot of microaggression, right? That was a far worse world. That was basically a world that Black Americans, that Latinas face every single day. We thought Asians were way better off. That was something they had to stand by. I also think they don't really provide a counterfactual anyway, or engage with our counterfactual at all, because like their Jewish counterfactual is just not right in the first place anyway. And also importantly, please engage with our material about being hardworking and not just like other stuff as well. Secondly, then, I think that just proves then the model minority perception is something that largely benefits people and is because of the perceptions that you become attached to. Secondly, then, on what is the effect of this on individuals? Because I think this is where their main kind of material comes out. The first big push they give you at first app is this leads to things like the fetishization of women. Two responses, right? Firstly, we think obviously things like fetishizing Asian women was something that was obviously like a broader social issue, right? Like it wasn't just only perpetuated by being like the model minority, right? In fact, that stuff was probably brought to you by things like Hollywood and like sexualization of women anyway. And instead, the model minority looked more like things about like hard work, about integration, all those types of things, as opposed to like your sex appeal, right? But secondly, we thought insofar as you are like an Asian woman, you probably were much more empowered because of the model minority myth, because of the model minority perception, right? Things like you firstly got an education because you worked hard and got into a good college or university. Things like your family values, which told you that you were intelligent and that you had lots of self-worth, was something that meant you were less likely to be fetishized or put yourself in a position like that. Thirdly, things like you have a job and social security, as well as a massive support network from that job, necessarily was going to be was meant that you weren't going to be locked into like things like fetishization. The second push they give you here is that it leads to lots of things like whitewashing, like people feeling pressure that they have to do like double eyelid surgery or stuff as well. I think that, like, firstly, I think that again comes with a lot of external pressure that pushes you onto those things. Those were things that fell outside of the bounds of the debate, right? But secondly, we thought like even like because the debate was more about things like education of things like jobs, right? As opposed to like exactly like in terms of those aspects of the model minority perception. But thirdly, we thought if you're an Asian woman and you wanted to get double eyelid surgery, then good on you, because like people face social pressures all the time, and that is fine, because if that meant that you were going to feel more confident when you walked into a boardroom and like you were able to like deliver your presentation better, then that was totally fine as well. Like beauty standards are coercive. This falls out of the debate entirely. But fourthly, we thought that and this response to their stuff about why integrating is bad. I think insofar as you are diaspora, right? You come from a country in pursuit of a better life, that it was probably okay that you integrate into a country. You probably create a specific and new identity, right? That fused your Asian elements as well as like Western elements. And that was probably going to be fine, because that's why you see things like the rise of Asian Americans as their own identity and not a lot of appreciation around that culture. You are not necessarily just locked to where you came from in your homeland as well. Secondly, here they tell you that about stuff about emotions, right? Like you can't get support from your families, you're not going to show emotion. Firstly, I think there is a difference between like the perception that you don't show emotions versus the fact that you don't have emotions. Like even if the model minority perception tells you Asians don't have emotions, they obviously do. When you are with your family, you will still have you still have talks with your family. They are still there for emotional support. You can still cry to your family, and your family probably supports you even more because of the model minority perception, because now all their resources are dedicated towards you. That's why we see in a lot of Asian families that like all their resources are dedicated towards you in terms of your academic success, in terms of your job success. That also means that they care more about you and how you feel, because if you are stressed or sad, you probably can't perform as well academically. That gives an incentive for them to actually want to help you as well. And obviously you will still talk to your family, you will still talk to your friends and siblings, stuff like that. Also, like importantly here, we thought that the perception that you were emotional was probably going to be really bad, because then like society can weaponize that against you and show that like you as and they can view you as ungrateful, or they can view you as too like emotionally volatile to perform a good job. That's like co-optation and narratives that we often see talk about women. That's why insofar as you were seen as level-headed, that necessarily got you better jobs and employment. The second thing they tell you here is that you will probably have a really stressful childhood, right? I think firstly, it's probably going to be way worse in like, your home country as well. And secondly, like insofar as you go into a Western country, you're probably going to gain values that they wanted to tell you about as well. And like things like high standards are probably good for things like motivation, because they make that you got higher jobs as well. And like maybe it doesn't matter like if you feel like you're not achieving success, because you are now like $500,000 better off, and that was something that directly benefited you. That means you could probably buy things or go on holidays that brought you happiness, that reduced your stress. You still had agency to do that. That's why, in terms of individuals, you are still going to be able to have emotional voids with your family and with your friends, and that support system, it was just socially perceived that you wouldn't. Thirdly, on why this perception allows for acceptance from broader society and better outcomes. I think this is more about this debate was more about how people perceive you in wider society rather than how you perceive yourself. And this is where our main material comes out. I don't think they engage with any of this. Importantly here, I think model minorities allow you to get better economic stability, because because that looks like things, and economics was always going to be best because that looked like things like social stability, that looked like things like respect from other people, that looked like things like in America where your job is tied to your healthcare, that looked like things like healthcare. Those were all benefits we got because of this. The first thing they tell you here is that this locks you out of certain professions like leadership or humanities and the arts. I think firstly, you're more likely to get in the first place because there is a perception that you are actually have skill, and that you are also, importantly, secondly, not seen as like a threat, right? Because they much less put someone in who they thought was a threat as well. And we thought insofar as you got into those positions, that was much better. I think this is substantiated in real world examples, right? Because there are lots of Asians in powerful positions. This looks like being a head surgeon because that was something based on your skill, because you got all that training because of this perception. But things like in the UK, when half of the Conservative Party is full of Southeast Asians, that was something that got you into leadership positions. But thirdly, we thought there was lots of leaderships at a local levels in terms of local councillors, things that you see in Australia even, that was meant that you were still going to get incremental change. That change was better than no change whatsoever. So proud to negate.
The problem that this negative team faces is that almost the entirety of their case and benefits are premised on the minority of Asian people who do have fifth-generation families in the West. But increasingly, as immigration grew more frequent and was happening in greater numbers, this model minority myth just was not true for the majority of Asian people in the Western world. It was not true that they all had wealth. It was not true that they all had high-paying jobs. That was true of a small section of the most privileged members of this community, but that unfortunately meant that the least privileged had almost no ability to access social support. Think about nonprofits that target helping Asian Americans. I cannot think of any that exist. I doubt anybody in this room can either. Think about government programs that are specifically targeted at helping Asian Americans or Asian Canadians or Asian British people or any other group of Asian people in the West. There are so few. And the reason for that is because society buys into this narrative, and in part, the group itself buys into this narrative and does not realize that there is a real need for support. Instead, there are programs that actively hurt this group. There are things like affirmative action and the way that that is applied in American universities, which mean that it is infinitely harder for Asian Americans to get into university than it is for white Americans, which is a perverse outcome if I have ever heard one. So let's talk about the counterfactual in this debate firstly. I think it is unfair for them to suggest things like, oh, Asian people will be treated in a similar way to African people or in a similar way to Arab people, because obviously there are some things in this debate that are unchangeable in terms of the historical progression of the Asian American experience, right? I think that what is more useful here to think about is the fact that the use of the term model minority and the lionization of hard work and the claims that it is that hard work, it is that desire to integrate, that is what has led to success, is probably the clearest thing that we can immediately do away with. Because I think that our counterfactual is a perception of Asian people that probably is somewhat less changed from the original perception that existed when immigration first began. Probably more of an association with things like poverty, and probably more of an association with things like being from underdeveloped countries and what have you. And maybe that also has harms, but I think that if we can make this debate clear and say that the one thing we certainly do not have under our side is this aggressive focus on hard work and submission, that is probably something that means that this debate is clear and means that I think we can explain quite obviously why it is that we are winning. The first point I make here is on social support. I think that they are correct in saying that it is good that there is less policing in these communities in terms of that there is not over policing, but I would suggest that probably the opposite problem occurs. Firstly, I think when you perceive this group as being homogenous, as being submissive and nonviolent, that means that if anything, you are more likely to see under policing in these areas, which is also probably a harm at the point that in particular, the most vulnerable, most recent immigrants had less access to things like police support when they were dealing with things like abusive relationships, or police support when they were dealing with things like white violence against them. And note that that white violence against them was far more common when you had this belief that Asian people were submissive and nonviolent and not likely to fight back, which is, I think, why you see so frequently things like videos of white Australians racially abusing Asian people on buses, things like white Australians or white Americans engaging in violence against Asian people, because those white people think that they're not going to fight back. They associate them with this model minority myth. They associate them with submissiveness, and they think that they can just scream slurs at them and they will face no consequences for that. And sure, it is a good thing, of course, that you don't have more violence, but I think that when you have this particular myth that invites more racial violence against Asian people, from white people, but also meant that you had less access to police as well. And that was, I think, something that was doubly incredibly difficult. I would point to the violence in the United States as evidence of this. The second thing that they say is that this myth means that you have more political representation. We say that that is minimal in the status quo. They assert that half of the British Conservative Party is made of Asians. Maybe that is true, but I think if you look at every other area in the West, it is not. And I think that the UK here is probably a specific example because of historic relations with India, which meant that you had more South Asian immigration in the UK and established South Asian families in particular. That is not true in the rest of the West. But I would also suggest that political representation within a party that doesn't seem to translate towards half of the British House of Commons being Asian American is not that meaningful. And when that representation is also restricted to a single party, it is probably even less meaningful as well. But we would also suggest that there are structural reasons to believe that that political representation is unlikely in the majority of circumstances. Because of that focus on submissiveness, again, nobody wants to think that they're electing a representative who won't aggressively fight for them. And that is why Asian people often find it difficult to succeed in politics as well. The final thing I would say is that there is actually a clear imperative in this debate, and that is that things like new immigrant families or poorer Asian communities in particular, your Tibetan people, Bhutanese people, people who are not wealthy Chinese fifth generation immigrants especially, did need social support. They needed to have things like extra support into getting into universities, because these are people that came from less developed countries, had less accumulated wealth, were brand new in these countries, less English skills as well. And those are the people that desperately needed things like programs that would engage in mental health outreach, programs that would engage in wealth transfer or support. And they did not get them because white society lumped all Asian immigrants or all Asian communities as being the same thing, when in fact it was only a minority group that was successful and privileged, and the rest desperately needed this support, but we're not getting it because of this myth. I think the final thing I would suggest is that when you look at the hatred that most white people have towards the idea of Asian immigrants coming and stealing their jobs, the last idea that negative gives us is also clearly untrue. It is empirically untrue that white people are more tolerant of Asian people in their workforce or more tolerant of Asian immigration because they think, oh, how good, they're hardworking, that's so great for society. The opposite is true. Because of this belief that they are hardworking, and in particular harder working than white people, they're perceived as more of an economic threat, which is why you see such particular revulsion towards them and such particular hatred towards that group of immigrants that you just don't see being applied to other groups of immigrants like European immigrants or Jewish immigrants in particular. The final thing I want to talk about here is identity. I think here what you can say is that because of that value of submissiveness and assimilation that exists in particular internally within these communities, that means that it is incredibly difficult for Asian Americans or Asian immigrants to find much when it comes to pride or value in their culture. I think it's much harder to do things like value your Chineseness or value the culture of your ancestors or your family back in these home countries, when the main value that is being pushed on you is that the way to succeed is to be as white as possible, which I think means that you are trapped in a really unfortunate position where you have to grapple with the fact that you are and are seen as Asian, but it is very difficult for you to find value in that trait. You are trapped with this trait that is difficult to value, difficult to reconcile, and difficult for you to look in the mirror and see value in that thing, which I think is when you start to see things like particularly narrow conceptions of what success looks like, combined with this difficulty in finding pride in yourself, in your appearance, in your ties to culture, which leads to the particularly damaging mental health outcomes that we tell you about at Niamh, in terms of people who do not fit within this very narrow definition of what it means to be a model minority and what it means to be success, find it incredibly difficult to open up to their families, to open up to their communities, but also to even admit that they have a problem, to admit that they're not succeeding, and to seek out mental health. That is something that is a problem in regular society that is magnified in particular in Asian American or Asian immigrant societies, because the shame comes from admitting that you are not living up to those standards, that you do need mental health, that your anxiety is a problem. But in much of your society, it is the value in working hard, pushing through it, and trying to shut up and conform to this stereotype that is valued. I think at the end of this, we prove two things conclusively. The first is that a majority of Asian immigrants and an increasing majority of Asian immigrants are missing out on valuable government support they would otherwise get that we see given to other minority groups. The second thing is that you see far worse mental health outcomes, far less ability to seek help for those things. Both of those, I think, conclusively win us this debate.
There's a reason that the conception of the comparative that we got from the affirmative team shifted between every single speaker, and they were unable to really realize what the world they were supporting looked like. And that was because we gave you 4 clear reasons at Eugene why our comparative was much more likely. Why in the absence of being a model minority, white people will simply see you as a minority. They gave no reason why they would ever be respected in society, like separate to the fact that they're viewed as a model minority. And we think it's in fact laughable that they're trying to win on the comparative as well. 3 things that I'm going to deal with in the speech. Firstly, on that comparative issue, why we conclusively win that. Secondly, dealing with both cases, whether we haven't or have won that, how minorities internalize that minority, model minority perception. And then finally, and more importantly, I think how wider society views it and the impacts that has on minority groups, Asian minority groups. Okay. Firstly, let's deal with the comparative. Note firstly, Eugene gives you 4 good reasons why our comparative is likely to be true. None of these are ever picked up on. Firstly, that you're likely to be seen as an other anyway. Secondly, that there's language barriers. Thirdly, that there's historical media stereotypes. And finally, that you're literally just small in numbers, which means it's very hard to assimilate and be seen as only the good stuff. They can't, as Yijun tells you, they can't just pick and choose the good stuff about being viewed as an Asian person. They have to deal with the benefits of the model minority as well. What do we get? We get 2 pushes from second affirmative. The second is that like success, it'll be the same, just less aggressive. It'll be like Jewish people. Like we tell you they're also a model minority, but even if that was the case, like that just diminishes their benefits and like increases our harms as well. The second thing they say is that, well, people won't fear them in the same way as black people because they don't have those same like internalized historical perceptions. But we think the reason that people don't fear them in many cases is due to the assimilation that you get from being a model minority. And they accept this in their own definition of what a model minority looks like. The final thing to deal with here is the shift we get at third affirmative, which is that the use of the term model minority is what matters. Like the use of model minority as the reason for hard work rather than the fact that they hard work themselves. Firstly, we just think this is too late to be weighted like significantly in this debate. Secondly, but that's not engaging with their own conception of what a model minority means, right? They tell you that being a model minority means looking like hard work. It looks like being someone who's not going to like necessarily speak up. It looks like someone who's going to assimilate. But note here that a lot of their pushes also aren't unique to this term. And I'll deal with this later. But a lot of the harms they identify with things like stress aren't unique to the term model minority. They're unique to the like distinct social pressures from both home country and current country that act on these families and make those kids so stressed. What is the impact of the acceptance of our comparative in this debate? It means all the harms Eugene outlined to you and Yijun like capitalized on about how you get shut out of politics, how you get over policing, which I'm pretty sure is probably pretty bad compared to under policing. They can't just figure that away, but also just generally like all the harms that other minorities struggle with in society that they've never engaged with, never said why specifically they won't apply to these minorities when they're not seen as model minorities. They still stand. That is the comparative. It is not that these people will be treated like any other white person. Is that they will be treated as inferior. At least in some respects, these people are seen as something to idolize by the like general white people in society today. We win at that point in the debate. If you don't buy that, I'm still going to deal with why we beat them on their comparative. But if you do buy that, note that everything else I'm doing in the speech is simply extending the margin of our victory. Okay, firstly, how you personally internalize the perception of being a model minority. They had 4 key pushes here. The first and the main one was about stress. And note here that this was heavily emphasized at first, but got diminishing in power throughout the debate because they recognized that it wasn't really going to win the debate. Why was this? Firstly, we told you it was literally usually external, right? Look at mainland China. The kids there are incredibly stressed. Look at Korea. They've got like that big exam they have to do at the end of high school. They have heaps of high pressure to do that. It's no reason from them why model minority perception necessarily made that stress work. In fact, we tell you model minority perception means that you assimilate. You're more likely to get Western values of like caring about mental health into your family, which means you're less likely to be stressed there. The second thing we said is even if this was the case, stress is probably a good thing because hard work leads to success. And finally, Eugene tells you about media accountability. The second push they tell you is about fetishization and sexism. Eugene sufficiently deals with this by saying you're better able to deal with it if you're like well supported in society, so it becomes contingent on the other material. But secondly, that's just independent from model minority perceptions as well. That's just general racism. The third thing is that they say is you need to internalize the need to be white. We give you 4 reasons that Yijun like why that's not the case. Finally, at third affirmative, they bring this big push about cultural value, and you'll lose like your connections with your old culture. First, we just don't think they like ever really mechanized why the model minority perception, especially given the characterization they gave us at third, that it's only the word, is ever going to make this disappear. But also we point to the fact that being Asian American, for example, is now its unique culture, and it's fine that they can thrive in their own like personal identity that's different to where they were before. Why is this important? They say this is important at second because it affects all the individuals in the debate. So do all the other issues in this debate. Unclear why that matters. But more importantly, we think most of the perception of Asian people being a model minority is held by white people, right? It's not so much an internal thing as an external thing. So because of that, the external impact in this debate is far more important. And also they just deprioritized it throughout the debate. Okay. Finally, and most importantly, how wider society looks at this issue. Let's deal with their key pushes. The first thing they say is the definition of success is very limited and it's very hard to achieve that very, very high bar. We tell you that the fact, firstly, that you're assimilating is probably, as I said in the stress point, likely to like put some Western values that you realize it's okay and maybe you should care like holistically about your mental health there. But secondly, even if you felt like you didn't succeed, you literally have succeeded by an objective measure, right? So you literally can provide food for your family when otherwise you might not have been able to. That's probably far more important than just thinking, oh, I wasn't the best doctor I could have been. It's probably more important that you're actually able to provide for the people that need it. The second thing to look at is what we say. We tell you about politics. They say you will never get any representation. We don't think you ever really mechanize this. What do we tell you? Even if you don't get great representation, at least you get some representation. More importantly, you get local representation. But look at the comparative, right? If you're seen as assertive as bad, then if you're seen like another minority, that probably means you're seen as a threat as well. The second thing we tell you is you literally are more successful when you get jobs. The push we get at third affirmative is that white people will be less tolerant to you because you're literally stealing their jobs. What do we tell you? Well, we tell you that white people who are racist here are probably not particularly rational actors, right? That's why Trump can get them all to hate Mexicans, even though Mexicans aren't really stealing the same sort of jobs that they're employed in. But more importantly, the fact that these people are seen as submissive and like useful means that these white people think they can use them to get ahead themselves. They're probably going to be accepting of their place there. Let's deal with racism. They said a few things, that the burden gets pushed into the individuals, not the system, and that will lower quotas for the whole people. Firstly, look at the comparative, we win there. But even if that's not the case, this is because these people are doing fine, right? That's just a mitigatory point at best. But even if, we think these quotas are likely to help the most vulnerable people. The second thing they say is this can be a talking point against other groups. That's not part of this debate. It's about what's better for Asian Americans or Asian people in Western society. Compare that with our unresponded to material from Eugene about like 5 reasons why people are likely to be less racist that they never engage with. When you're weighing up that issue, look at this. The final thing they say at third is that you're not going to get support, for example, from NGOs. That's untrue. Look at the media at the moment. Look at all the stuff going around Instagram about how we need to support Asian Americans, but also they just get included in general person of color quotas. The final push they give you at third, which is a bit strange, was it was like only rich Asian families will get the benefits, not new immigrants. Look, being a model minority, we tell you, gives you an ability to break through social barriers. You can directly get jobs from all the things Eugene tells you, but also just to immigrate in the first place, you probably needed a certain level of wealth at all. Note that they just asserted that none of these benefits applied to first-generation immigrants when we were quite clear in telling you why specifically the perception of being able to assimilate, of being a functioning member of Western society, means that Western white people are not likely to discriminate you in much the same way. That's why we win this debate, because that's much better than the comparative.